Hi, I'm Jen Best from Beaker Button, and I'm going to show you how to make a beaded crop circle Dorset button. This is a way of putting beads onto your button as you're doing your rounding pattern. You will need some thread. I use 4-ply and a button bobbin. You'll need some size 8 seed beads, a tapestry needle, a needle threader and a ring. I'm using a 43mm closed ring. If you want to change the size of the ring, obviously change the size of the materials. Start by wrapping 5 meters of thread around your button bobbin. That's more than enough for doing the button. So you're going to start off with a single knot, tying it around your ring, just leaving about a 2 centimeter tail, and you'll hold your ring in your non-stitching hand and then use the bobbin as a needle. Bring it through from the back and then pass it right to left underneath, and then pull tight, making sure that you slip your stitch over the top of the tail, so you're stitching that tail down as you're going. And you'll come up from the back, right to left underneath, and make sure the tail sits inside the stitch as you work it. And you're going to do this all the way round, pulling really tightly, so you'll get a little ridge that forms around the outside. This is called casting. If you're left-handed, you may want to do it the opposite way round and work sort of the other way round on your ring, but do what's comfortable. And you'll just keep bringing that bobbin through, going straight underneath the thread, and then pulling tight, making sure the stitch is capturing the tail inside. You'll see the little ridge forming, and you'll see just around here there's the ridge, just around the outside. So casting is where you're covering your ring. It's the official term for it. Every now and then just let some thread out. That's it. Once you've gone over the tail, everything is much quicker. And when you start to get a little close with the bobbin, just unwind a couple of turns from the bobbin so you've got a bit more thread to play with. Just like that. And I'm pulling really tight as I'm working around the ring. You can see my ridge just starting to form under my fingers there. If you're doing this with a needle, you're going to use quite a lot of thread. So I would have my needle nearly halfway down the thread, and I would be pulling it quite firmly, sort of almost jerking it through to pull a lot of the thread through all at once. When I'm using these bobbins, it's so much easier. Just make it that little bit less fiddly because you're only using a short length of thread at a time. You see now I've gone over the tail. It's moving around quite quickly. So I do my blanket stitch, which is what this stitch actually is, of the opposite way round on a ring to the way that I do it on fabric. And I think that's because it makes it easier for me to catch the tail down. But as long as you're forming that ridge round, if you've got a different way of doing it that's making it nice and tight around the outside, then obviously do that. So, okay, just let a little bit more thread out. My dodgy camera getting a bit blurry, sorry about that. I think it's getting a bit old and it just takes a minute or two to catch up with me moving. If you're wondering what the green is on my hands, I've been dyeing yarn, so I've got interesting coloured hands. You see how quickly I'm going round there. So one of the things that you might find with your thread is that it starts to get a bit tangly. And you'll start to find it twisting underneath and making it a little harder to work with. And if that's the case, the easiest thing is to let either the button bobbin or the ring dangle. I tend to let my button bobbin dangle and just let it unspin. I'll show you that in a second. And you may need to do it several times as you're working round. Nearly back to the start now. And I haven't been squashing the stitches in, but I am pulling them quite tight, and I pull slightly back so they sit nicely and cover the metal completely. Just get those last few stitches in here. Okay, and once you've gone all the way around, just make sure you can't squash anything else in, just that last little bit. Maybe get 3 or 4 more stitches in there. There. And that's my ring cast round with my ridge on the outside. So then all I'm going to do is turn the ridge onto the inside using my thumb and forefinger just to roll it round so it sits in the centre of the ring. Makes it nice and neat. And the reason you do the casting and then slicking, which is the bit where you're wrapping your or moving your ridge round, is because it's easier to get it nice and tight if you're pulling out. So you get a nice firm ring. So then you're going to take off some thread, and I would take off a couple of meters or so. You can always put it back on if you need to. And you need to check that you've got enough taken off to wrap round the ring 6 times. So I'm just wrapping it round 6 times just to make sure that I've got enough thread to do my laying, which is the next step. So you're going to hold it right on the edge so you can see the whole circle. You're going to bring the thread down from the back underneath at 6 o'clock and then wrap it back over at 12. That's your first spoke. And then turn the ring slightly and wrap it round at the 7 o'clock point to the left and then 1 o'clock to the right. So what you're actually doing is wrapping it right over the centre with that last wrap. Round at 8 o'clock and then over the centre. Round at 9 o'clock and over the centre. And it's really important to get that top spoke really central. And you're going to come round and over the centre again, keeping that distance at the bottom the same, and then you should have one last spoke to wrap, which will be 11 o'clock, and over the centre. Pinch that last one between your thumb and forefinger to stop it escaping, and then you want to gather all the spokes into the centre, so you'll find the little point at the back where everything crosses. So if you're looking at the back of the button, it's just to the left of the last spoke you laid, which is the one that's on the top, just to the left there. So you're going to bring your needle up through that point, or rather your bobbin at this point, and then drop it down the opposite side, making a stitch across the centre and pulling all those spokes into the centre. So you can pull that thread, that stitch that you've just made, really firmly. You've got one that goes from east to west, and then you're going to come up at north and go down at south, and then that gives you a crossed stitch in the centre, and then that's your laying done. So now you've got a framework that you can stitch round, and we're going to do 3 or 4 rounds just as a normal back stitch. So we're going to come up through the work and go down over one clockwise. And then we're going to come back up under 2 spokes anti-clockwise. That includes the one you've just gone over. So that's 1, 2, and then go down over that one clockwise. And that's your back stitch pattern. So you're coming back under 2. So this is your second one, or coming up to the left of the spoke on the left is another way of looking at it. And then down over 1, and you'll start to see your stitches forming just on the inside of that wheel thing there. That's it. So you keep going round, down over 1 clockwise, back under 2 anti-clockwise. Try to just go over the 1, I obviously did 2 there. That's it, and just keep going round. Every now and then push the stitches into the centre, because the middle slips, because the back spokes are always working to pull it sideways. So you will just push everything over into the centre. That's it, let's just keep going. You keep that back stitch correct, and you'll work 3 to 4 rounds in the middle, keeping pushing it into the centre every few stitches, just to keep it nice and central. That's your first round done, and then you just keep going. So you come up under 2 and then go down over 1. You'll keep doing that all the way round. Just keep going with it. And this is where, if it gets a bit twisty, just let the bobbin unspin, and then you'll see it's nice and straight again. It's much easier to deal with the thread if it's not got a lot of extra twist in. Everybody twists when they stitch, so it's just learning to deal with that twist as it comes up. So I'm just going to keep rounding now until I've got 3 or 4 rounds, and what I'm looking for is enough space to place a bead between the 2 spokes. So for this particular pattern, I'm going to put 6 beads on my first beaded round, and then I'm going to put 12 beads on my second beaded round, and I'm going to work some plain rounds without beads in between. But your spacing, your spokes need to be wide enough at the point you put the beaded round to actually sit comfortably. So you need to do however many rounds it takes of just the back stitch to place your bead. And again, I'm pulling this fairly tight. I actually hold it in my fingers at the front and then at the back every time I do a stitch. My spare fingers, you'll see my my middle finger rather, coming out and just grabbing the thread each time. That just keeps it tight on the spoke, so it stops the stitches becoming too sloppy. Just let a little bit of twist out again there. If you can hear the rumbling behind me, that's the road. I'm sitting in my shop at the moment doing this. So there's this low rumble of traffic going past behind. I don't know if that will come out on the audio, sorry. One day I'll have sophisticated equipment that I can do proper taping. And then when you've got enough rounds, you're going to take all of the thread off the bobbin. So when you're far enough out that you think your beads will fit nicely in between the spokes, take all the thread off the bobbin. And then you're going to thread the beads onto the thread. And they're too small to go over the needle. So this is a nifty way of getting them onto the thread. So I've got 6 there, and I'm picking one up with the needle threader and just pushing it down onto the needle threader. And then I'm going to put the thread inside the needle threader and then fold that over so it's caught, and then the bead slides off the needle threader and onto the thread. You're going to do that with 6 because we're going to do 6 beads for this round. So I'm loading all the beads for this round up all in one go. And just keep doing one at a time. If you've got a big needle threader, you can sometimes get 2 at a time on. And if you're doing multicolours, you can obviously plan which colour goes where. Just doing this nice cerise pink colour because I like pink and green. Just roll the end of the thread there. It gets a little bit frayed and doesn't like to go in the needle threader. So then you're going to push those those beads right down to almost to the ring, and you'll settle that first one in between the spokes of the next stitch and then put the needle on. So I'm threading my thread onto my needle, and all the other beads will just sit and I'll pull them through each gap. So I'm going to do my next stitch as normal. So I've got my bead in place, I'm holding it with my finger behind, and I've pulled all the thread up under 2, and then I'm pulling it all the way down over that 1. And then I'm going to skip the next one for a bead, so I'm just bringing that one up as normal, coming up under 2 and then stitching over 1. And then I'm going to position my next bead in the next gap along. So I'll move the bead up, settle it under in between the 2 spokes, and just hold it in place with my index finger, just so that keeps it nice and secure. And then I'm going to bring the needle up under 2 and go down and over 1. So the back stitch is exactly the same. You're just positioning your bead where you want them. So the next one I'm going to do without a bead. And then I'm going to put a bead. So as I'm working around, I'm missing one set of spokes, and then I'm putting a bead in the next set of spokes, so in between the 2. So if you want to change how many spokes you've got, you've obviously got to change how many beads you need. That's good. Just depends on what pattern you're doing. If you're just going to wing it, you could just see how many beads you could get on and just place beads where you feel like at the time. Free form button making. Just putting the last bead on. one stitch, then I'll just get that last bead, slide it into the right gap and do my last beaded back stitch, and then you've got one more stitch to do to finish that round. So you're coming up and down, so that's again keeping the back stitch correct. So I've got the same amount of stitches all the way round, and it just sits nicely. So I'm then going to do another 2 or 3 rounds of back stitch just to give myself a gap between my next set of beads. So this is the same as you were doing before. Over 1 clockwise and under 2 anti-clockwise. And you can move your stitches again, keep pushing the centre into the centre, just to keep things nice and neat. It helps to settle all the stitches nicely as well, and keep it fairly tight as you're stitching round. So again, you'll see me holding on to the thread between my spare fingers every stitch I make. And that traps those beads nicely in place once you've started to put a couple of rounds on the outside. And just push those down, the spokes or the stitches you've just done, just push them into the centre. And then you're ready to do your next beaded round. So it's the same process. You're going to take the needle off. You're going to use your needle threader to thread each of the beads on, and this time we're going to do 12. Because we're going to do one in each gap. So I'm placing the bead on the needle threader, placing the thread inside the needle threader, just rolling my end a bit if it's getting a bit frayed, and then sliding the bead down. And I'll load all of those beads that I need up onto the end of the thread. You can always trim the end of your thread if it gets a bit problematic. Obviously, if you've got beads that will go over the end of a needle that you can actually thread on your thread, you can just stitch them on one at a time. But I find these little size 8 seed beads, they don't mind going on a 4-ply thread, but they don't really like going over a needle. that's got a small enough, or a big enough eye rather, to take the 4-ply thread. And then I'm going to put my needle back on and move all my beads down to the bottom, and I'm going to carry on with that back stitch that I've been doing the whole time, but I'm going to put a bead in between each set of spokes. So just finishing off that last one, popping my bead in, coming up over the next spoke ready to do a stitch, and going down over clockwise. Place the next bead, coming up under 2, going down over 1, and you just wiggle the beads through, the ones that are on the thread that don't need to be placed yet. If you're struggling to wiggle them through, you can always thread them on one at a time, but it means unthreading the needle each time. So I like to have the whole round's worth of beads on my thread as I'm working my way around. And I'm going to make this my last round, but you can, of course, if you want to, keep stitching, keep doing back stitch, do a different pattern around the outside, add more beads on. It's up to you, really. I've obviously added one more bead than I need, so I'm just going to take the needle off and take that bead off, and then I'm going to thread my needle back on again. This is because I can't count very well. So this is the front, and I'm just pushing those beads and those stitches down into place. This is what the back looks like, and if you want it to be a bit double-sided, you can just push those beads through to the back a little so they pop out and show a little bit more. And then you're going to bring the needle up as if to do the next stitch, and then weave your needle down through one of the spokes. So this is working on the front, but it's the best way of hiding the thread. So you're going to weave down through to the centre, and that just fastens that off. And then weave back out on one of the other spokes out to the edge. And then if you want to make a hanging, you're going to weave from the back, but down one of the spokes. So you're going back down that same spoke that you came up just now, but you're passing it from the back, but still through the spoke. So sort of coming up from behind and then passing it down through to the centre. And then don't pull it all the way. What you want is to leave a loop for hanging. And then weave down through one of the other spokes to the other side. Again, this makes it more of an invisible finish, so when you're hanging it you can have both sides nicely visible. And that's your hanging. Now I would like, it hangs quite nicely at that point, but I prefer to have a couple more stitches weaving through just so that it's a little more secure. So my finishing off, I'll go down and come back up the next spoke, and then I'll weave through the centre, or weave through to the centre through one of the spokes again, and then weave out to the edge. So what you end up with is 3 passes through the button, and if you're clever you could make them on different spokes each time, but it doesn't really matter. Just weave it through, and that should make it nice and secure, and that loop won't pull out then. And you can just trim the thread off as close as you can get to the button. And then there are different ways of fixing. So we've just seen how to weave it to leave a hanging thread with the tail, and that gives you a double-sided hanging loop. You could finish off just by weaving through the back or through the spokes, and then use a separate piece of thread. So instead of making a hanging loop, trim it, tie a little loop in the end to make a loop of thread, not in the end to make a loop of thread, and then slide that loop underneath the ring and pass the knotted end through the loop. So you open out that loop, just pass the knotted end through. If you do macrame, it's a lark's head or a reverse lark's head. That works very well, makes a nice hanging loop, and it means that you can take the loop off if you want to and use it as a brooch later, and still gives you the both sides. And then if you want to do a brooch, weave through to the back. So you've got, and choose your side, you're going to put 2 stitches with the tail on either side of each thread, and you're going to come, each hole rather, on the brooch back, and you're going to come through to the front of the brooch and then the back. And what I would always do is sew it on with the brooch back open, and that gives you a brooch. So you could do little hangings for people and then make them into brooches for Christmas. Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. Any questions, please do send me an email and I'll try to answer them. Bye.